I'm Sarah, and I'm a 29-year-old emergency medicine physician. For years, I believed my parents were just practical people who wanted both their daughters to succeed in medicine. I thought the extra jobs, the sleepless nights, and the constant financial stress I endured through medical school were just part of building character. I thought my sister Emma's different experience was because she was naturally more fragile, more sensitive. But what I discovered 2 months ago shattered everything I believed about my family and showed me a level of manipulation so calculated it still takes my breath away. If you've ever felt like the family workhorse while watching a sibling get treated like precious cargo, this story is going to hit you right in the chest. Because what my parents did wasn't just favoritism. It was a systematic destruction of my self-worth while building a golden pedestal for my sister that cost them over $200,000. Growing up, Emma and I were both expected to become doctors. This wasn't a suggestion in our family, it was law. My father is an orthopedic surgeon, my mother a retired anesthesiologist, and medicine was our family legacy. From elementary school, our dinner conversations revolved around medical terminology, case studies, and the importance of carrying on the family tradition. Both Emma and I accepted this path without question. But even in childhood, the differences in how we were treated were subtle yet consistent. When Emma struggled with organic chemistry in high school, my parents hired a private tutor at $300 per week. When I struggled with calculus, my father told me to figure it out myself because real doctors don't give up. When Emma wanted to quit her part-time job at the frozen yogurt shop because it was affecting her social life, my parents agreed immediately. When I asked to reduce my hours at the grocery store because I was falling behind in AP courses, my mother reminded me that responsibility builds character. These patterns continued through college. Emma attended a prestigious private university where my parents covered her full tuition, room, board, and even her sorority fees. They bought her a car for her 18th birthday and paid for her spring break trips. Meanwhile, I attended the state university on partial scholarships I'd earned myself, working 25 hours per week at a campus coffee shop to cover my expenses. When I asked for help with textbooks that cost $800 per semester, my father told me that learning to manage money would make me a better doctor. I convinced myself this was fair. Emma was 2 years younger, and maybe by the time I was her age, our financial situation had been tighter. Maybe my parents had learned that struggle builds strength, and they were giving me a gift by teaching me independence. I rationalized every difference, every disparity, every moment when I felt invisible while Emma glowed in their attention. Medical school applications arrived, and both Emma and I applied to the same programs. The MCAT prep courses my parents paid for Emma cost $4,000. I studied with borrowed books and free online resources. When Emma's scores came back lower than expected, my parents hired a private consultant for another $3,000 to help strengthen her application essays. When my scores exceeded Emma's by 12 points, my father's only comment was that I'd probably studied harder because I had to. We both got accepted to medical schools, though Emma's was a private institution with yearly tuition of $68,000, while mine was the state medical school with yearly tuition of $32,000. I felt proud that I'd earned my spot at a competitive program. I had no idea that my parents had made a donation to Emma's school, something I wouldn't discover until much later. The real divergence began during our first year. Medical school is brutal for everyone, but my experience was particularly crushing because I was also working. While Emma studied with her private tutor, yes, they hired her a medical school tutor at $200 per hour, I was pulling double shifts at a medical clinic's administrative office. While Emma joined study groups and built relationships with classmates, I was exhausting myself trying to balance 20 hours of work per week with the most demanding academic program of my life. The financial stress was constant and overwhelming. Even with student loans, I was struggling to cover basic living expenses. I ate ramen noodles for dinner most nights, while Emma posted Instagram photos from the trendy restaurants near her campus. I studied in the hospital break room during my shifts, while Emma had a quiet apartment paid for by our parents. I wore the same 3 professional outfits on rotation, while Emma's wardrobe seemed to expand monthly. When I called my parents asking for help, just something to ease the financial pressure so I could focus on my studies, my mother explained that they'd already invested so much in my education through state school, and learning to manage independently would make me stronger in residency. They reminded me that many medical students work, and I wasn't special for struggling. Meanwhile, Emma's social media showed a completely different medical school experience. Photos with classmates at medical conferences, professional networking events, and expensive study retreats. When I commented on how lucky she was to have time for all these opportunities, she told me she was just better at time management. By second year, I was barely sleeping 4 hours per night. My grades, while still strong, weren't the stellar marks I'd achieved in undergraduate school. I was isolated from my classmates because I never had time for study groups or social events. I was developing anxiety and having panic attacks from the constant stress of balancing work and school. Meanwhile, Emma was thriving. She was elected to student government, joined multiple medical organizations, and was already networking with attending physicians who might provide research opportunities. When I tried to talk to my parents about my struggles, they reminded me that medicine is demanding, and this was good preparation for the realities of being a physician. They suggested I learn better time management from Emma, who seemed to be handling everything so well. The comparison stung every time, but I internalized it. Maybe I wasn't as naturally gifted as Emma. Maybe I needed to work harder, be stronger, complain less. The breaking point came during third-year rotations. I was working in the emergency department, finally feeling like I was finding my calling in medicine, when I got a call from Emma. She was crying, explaining that she was overwhelmed, that medical school was too hard, that she didn't think she wanted to be a doctor anymore. She wanted to drop out and pursue a master's degree in public health instead. I spent 2 hours on the phone with her, sharing every coping strategy I'd learned, every way I'd found to push through the exhaustion and self-doubt. I told her about my worst days and how I'd survived them. I reminded her that we were almost halfway through, that the hardest parts were behind us. I believed I was being a supportive sister, helping her find her strength. 3 days later, Emma called again. She'd talked to our parents, and they'd agreed that if medical school wasn't making her happy, she should pursue what felt right for her. They were going to support her decision to withdraw and help her apply to public health programs. I was shocked but tried to be supportive. If Emma wasn't happy in medicine, then leaving was probably the right choice. What I discovered later made me question every single thing I thought I knew about my family. Emma didn't just drop out of medical school. She moved back home, into her childhood bedroom, with no immediate plans for alternative education. For 6 months, while I continued grinding through my third-year rotations, working weekends at the clinic, and studying until 2 a.m. every night, Emma was living a completely different life. She slept until noon, went to yoga classes, met friends for lengthy brunches, and talked vaguely about maybe applying to graduate programs eventually. My parents supported this completely. They covered all her expenses, encouraged her to take time to find herself, and praised her for being brave enough to change directions. When I called home exhausted from a particularly brutal surgery rotation, they reminded me that I'd chosen this path and needed to stick with it. When I mentioned how tired I was, they suggested I learn from Emma's example of prioritizing mental health. The contrast became even more stark when Emma decided she wanted to travel to Europe for 3 months to gain perspective on her future. My parents funded this trip completely: flights, hotels, meals, and spending money totaling over $15,000. During this same period, I was eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch because I couldn't afford anything else, and I'd developed a stress-related stomach condition from the combination of poor nutrition and constant anxiety. When I asked my parents if they could help me with grocery money, just $50 per week so I could eat properly while working 60-hour weeks in the hospital, they told me that learning to budget was an important life skill. They said Emma's trip was different because she was going through a difficult transition and needed support. I started documenting everything. Not intentionally at first, but because I was so exhausted and confused that I began writing down conversations and events just to make sense of what was happening. The pattern became undeniable when I looked at it objectively. Emma received immediate financial support for wants and desires. I was denied basic assistance for needs directly related to my education and health. 4th year of medical school brought new challenges and new disparities. I was applying for residency programs, which required expensive travel for interviews across the country. Each interview trip cost between $500 and $1,200 for flights, hotels, and transportation. I applied for 14 programs and could only afford to attend 6 interviews. I went into credit card debt to cover even those. Emma, meanwhile, had decided she wanted to pursue a master's degree in public health after all. The application process for her program required no travel, but she did want to attend several information sessions at different universities to help her decide. My parents funded all of these trips, including a weekend in Boston that cost over $2,000 for her to visit Harvard's campus and get a feel for the city. When I mentioned that I had to decline several residency interviews because I couldn't afford to travel, my father suggested I could take out additional loans. When Emma wanted spending money for her Boston trip, they transferred $800 to her account for shopping and entertainment. The residency match process was one of the most stressful periods of my life. I was competing for positions in emergency medicine, a competitive specialty, while working part-time and carrying significant debt. I matched at a hospital 2,000 miles away, which meant I'd need to relocate with money I didn't have. I was thrilled to have matched at all, but the financial reality of moving across the country was overwhelming. Emma got accepted to a public health program at a university 40 minutes from our hometown. My parents celebrated by taking her out to an expensive dinner and giving her a $5,000 gift to congratulate her on her new direction. When I called to share my residency match news, they were pleased but reminded me that moving expenses were part of becoming an adult. I moved across the country with 3 suitcases, $800 in my checking account, and no furniture for my new apartment. I slept on an air mattress for 2 months because I couldn't afford a bed. Emma moved into a luxury apartment my parents helped her secure, complete with new furniture from West Elm and a monthly allowance to cover expenses while she focused on her studies. Residency was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. 80-hour weeks, constant sleep deprivation, and the enormous pressure of being responsible for human lives while still learning. I was also completely isolated, knowing no one in my new city, with no family support system. I called home regularly, hoping for encouragement, but my parents seemed more interested in hearing about Emma's graduate program and her new social circle. The financial stress continued throughout residency. My salary was $55,000 per year, which sounds reasonable until you account for my student loan payments of $1,800 per month, rent, and basic living expenses. I qualified for food stamps at one point but was too ashamed to apply. I shopped at thrift stores and bought expired produce from discount grocery stores. Meanwhile, Emma's social media showed a completely different experience. Photos from graduate school conferences, professional networking events, and weekend trips. When I asked her how she could afford such an active social life on a graduate student budget, she explained that our parents were helping her make professional connections and experiences that would benefit her career. During my second year of residency, Emma completed her master's program. My parents attended her graduation ceremony, took dozens of photos, and hosted a celebration party for family and friends. They gifted her a new car and announced they were helping her secure a position at a nonprofit organization where my father served on the board. I graduated from medical school without any family attendance because my parents couldn't afford to travel across the country for the ceremony. I celebrated alone in my empty apartment with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine I'd saved for the occasion. The disparity had become so normalized that I stopped questioning it directly. I focused on my residency training, worked extra shifts to pay down debt, and tried to build a life despite the constant financial stress. I convinced myself that I was becoming stronger, more independent, more resilient. I told myself that Emma needed more support because she was less capable of handling challenges. Then came the conversation that changed everything. During my third year of residency, Emma called me upset about her job at the nonprofit. She felt underappreciated, underpaid, and was considering leaving to pursue a PhD program. As always, I listened supportively and offered advice about navigating workplace challenges. During our conversation, she mentioned something that stopped me cold. She casually referenced a conversation with our parents about funding her potential PhD program, mentioning that they'd already supported her through so much education that she felt guilty asking for more. When I asked what she meant, she explained that our parents had paid for her entire medical school tuition, over $270,000, plus her living expenses, and then her master's degree program as well. I thought I'd misunderstood. I asked her to clarify, thinking she meant they'd helped with some expenses. Emma seemed confused by my confusion and explained that our parents had covered all of her educational costs from the beginning. She'd never taken out student loans. She'd never worked during school. She'd never worried about money because our parents handled everything. When I told her about my experience, the work-study jobs, the debt, the financial stress, she seemed genuinely shocked. She said she'd assumed I was working because I wanted the experience, not because I needed the money. She thought my parents were contributing to my education the same way they'd contributed to hers. That phone call lasted 4 hours. As we compared our experiences detail by detail, a horrifying picture emerged. We'd lived completely different realities, supported by completely different family systems, while being told we were being treated equally. Emma had received over $300,000 in direct educational and living support from our parents. I had received nothing beyond what they were legally obligated to provide during high school. Emma had been protected from every financial stress, while I'd been deliberately exposed to financial hardship that had compromised my health, my grades, and my mental well-being. When I asked Emma why she thought this difference existed, she said she'd always assumed it was because I was stronger and more capable of handling challenges independently. Our parents had told her that they worried about me less because I was naturally more resilient. I hung up the phone and immediately called my parents, demanding an explanation. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in gaslighting and manipulation that left me questioning my own memory and sanity. My mother insisted that they'd supported both Emma and me equally, just in different ways. She claimed that paying for Emma's education was balanced by the character-building experiences they'd given me through work and independence. My father suggested that I was being ungrateful for the values they'd instilled in me, and that comparing financial contributions was materialistic and unbecoming of a physician. When I presented specific examples and dollar amounts, they deflected. When I asked why Emma's education had been fully funded while mine required loans and work, they claimed they'd offered to help me, but I'd insisted on independence. When I pointed out that this was completely false, they suggested that my memory might be affected by the stress of residency. The conversation ended with my father telling me that successful people don't blame their families for their challenges, and my mother adding that they were disappointed in my attitude after everything they'd sacrificed for my education. I spent the next several weeks questioning everything. Had I somehow asked for this different treatment? Had I projected strength in a way that made my parents think I didn't need support? Was I being unfair by comparing financial contributions when they'd given me different but equally valuable gifts? Then I decided to document everything objectively. I created a spreadsheet tracking every financial contribution, every conversation I could remember, every disparity I'd experienced. I reached out to Emma regularly to compare memories and experiences. I even found old emails and text messages that contradicted my parents' revised version of events. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Emma had received over $300,000 in direct support. I had received $0 in direct educational support and had been actively discouraged from asking for help during periods of significant financial distress. More devastating was the psychological manipulation that had accompanied this disparity. I'd been told repeatedly that I was stronger, more capable, more resilient, while simultaneously being denied the support that would have allowed me to thrive. I'd been praised for my independence while being forced into isolation and financial stress that compromised my health and academic performance. I'd been taught to admire Emma's success while being blind to the extensive support system that made her success possible. I'd been encouraged to see my struggles as character building while her comfort was presented as necessary for her well-being. The most painful realization was that this hadn't been unconscious favoritism. This had been a deliberate, systematic strategy to extract maximum effort from me while providing maximum comfort to Emma. Every time I'd called asking for help, every time I'd expressed exhaustion or stress, every time I'd mentioned my financial struggles, my parents had chosen to maintain this system rather than provide equal support. Armed with documentation and Emma's support, I decided to have one final conversation with my parents. I flew home during a vacation week, not telling them I was coming, and arrived at their house with a folder full of evidence. I laid out the spreadsheet showing the financial disparity. I presented emails and text messages contradicting their claims about offering me support. I had Emma join the conversation by phone to confirm details about her experience. I methodically dismantled every excuse, every rationalization, every attempt to rewrite history. The conversation lasted 6 hours and was the most emotionally devastating experience of my adult life. When confronted with undeniable evidence, my parents' response wasn't apology or acknowledgement. Instead, they became angry that I was attacking their parenting and disrupting family harmony. They accused me of being jealous of Emma and trying to destroy family relationships with my obsession over money. My father eventually admitted that they'd made different choices for each daughter based on what they thought we needed. He claimed that Emma had required more support because she was more sensitive, while I had been strong enough to succeed independently. When I pointed out that their approach had caused me significant unnecessary hardship, he said that hardship had made me a better doctor and person. My mother added that they'd always been proud of my independence and strength, and they were hurt that I was now claiming those qualities were somehow harmful. She suggested that I was letting residency stress affect my judgment and that I should consider therapy to work through my resentment. The final blow came when my father told me that if I couldn't appreciate the values they'd instilled in me, maybe I needed to reevaluate my priorities and my relationship with the family. My mother concluded the conversation by saying that they loved both their daughters equally, but they were disappointed that I was choosing to focus on material support rather than the emotional love they'd always provided. I left their house that night knowing that our relationship could never return to what it had been. Not because of the money itself, but because of what the money represented, a fundamental lack of care for my well-being disguised as character building, and a willingness to sacrifice my success and health to maintain Emma's comfort. What happened next surprised everyone, including me. I stopped calling home regularly. I stopped participating in family group chats. I stopped sharing details about my residency training or my career progress. When my parents called to check in, I kept conversations brief and surface level. When they asked about my attitude change, I explained that I was focusing on my own life and couldn't invest emotional energy in relationships that didn't serve my well-being. Initially, they dismissed this as a phase related to residency stress. They expected me to eventually return to my role as the family workhorse who absorbed their criticism and manipulation while providing emotional support to everyone else. But I'd started therapy and was learning to recognize patterns of emotional abuse and family dysfunction. I was reading about scapegoat and golden child dynamics, financial abuse, and the long-term psychological effects of systematic family favoritism. I was understanding that my experience wasn't just about money. It was about a family system that required one child to sacrifice for another child's benefit. 6 months into my new boundaries, my parents began reaching out more frequently. They seemed confused and concerned about my distance. They started mentioning how much they missed our regular conversations and how Emma was worried about me. They suggested family therapy to work through whatever issues were affecting our relationship. I agreed to family therapy, but only with a therapist I selected who specialized in family dysfunction and financial abuse. The sessions were revelatory and painful. With a neutral third party facilitating, the extent of the manipulation and gaslighting became undeniable. In therapy, my parents initially maintained their position that they'd treated both daughters fairly, just differently. But when the therapist asked them to explain the specific reasoning behind spending over $300,000 on one child's education while requiring the other child to go into debt, they struggled to provide coherent justification. The therapist helped illuminate the psychological damage caused by their approach. She explained how financial disparities in families can create trauma, self-worth issues, and long-term trust problems. She highlighted how their messaging about my strength and independence had been used to justify neglect rather than celebrate genuine capabilities. Most importantly, she helped my parents understand that their impact mattered more than their intentions. Even if they believed they were helping me by teaching independence, the result had been years of unnecessary hardship, isolation, and psychological damage. Emma attended several therapy sessions and was crucial in helping our parents understand the reality of our different experiences. She confirmed details about the extensive support she'd received and acknowledged that she'd been shielded from stresses that had nearly broken me. She expressed genuine guilt about benefiting from a system that harmed her sister, even though she hadn't created or controlled that system. The breakthrough came when my father finally acknowledged that their approach had been unfair and harmful. He admitted that they'd rationalized treating me differently because it was easier than acknowledging they were playing favorites. He recognized that calling my hardships character building had been a way to avoid feeling guilty about their choices. My mother's acknowledgement was more difficult to achieve, but eventually she admitted that they'd failed to protect my well-being while prioritizing Emma's comfort. She acknowledged that their messaging about my strength had been manipulative and that they'd used my resilience as an excuse to withhold support rather than a reason to celebrate my capabilities. Recovery and healing have been ongoing processes that continue today. Family therapy helped establish new patterns of communication and accountability, but rebuilding trust has required consistent changes in behavior, not just acknowledgement of past mistakes. My parents have taken concrete steps to address the financial disparity they created. They've paid off my remaining student loans and provided financial support that's helped me establish stability during residency. More importantly, they've changed how they talk about my experiences and accomplishments, acknowledging the additional challenges I faced rather than dismissing them as character building. Emma and I have developed a stronger, more honest relationship, built on her acknowledgement of the different realities we lived and her commitment to supporting fairness in family dynamics going forward. She's become an advocate for recognizing when systems benefit some family members at the expense of others. I've continued therapy individually to work through the psychological effects of years of family manipulation and financial stress. I've learned to recognize my own worth independent of my family's approval and to set boundaries that protect my well-being rather than maintaining family comfort. The most significant change has been in my relationship with myself. I no longer internalize criticism or dismiss my own needs as excessive. I've learned that asking for support isn't weakness and that receiving help doesn't diminish personal accomplishments. I've stopped carrying responsibility for other people's emotional well-being at the expense of my own. I'm now finishing my residency training and will be starting as an attending emergency physician next year. I've built genuine friendships with colleagues who value and support me. I've developed financial stability and independence that's based on my own efforts rather than family dynamics. I've created a life that reflects my values and priorities rather than fulfilling other people's expectations. Most importantly, I've learned to trust my own perceptions and advocate for my own needs. I no longer dismiss my experiences or rationalize other people's harmful behavior. I've developed the ability to maintain relationships with people who treat me well while setting firm boundaries with those who don't. My parents and I have a relationship today, but it's based on mutual respect and accountability rather than my role as the family scapegoat. They're no longer allowed to dismiss my experiences, gaslight my memories, or manipulate me into accepting unfair treatment. When they revert to old patterns, I address it directly or remove myself from the situation. This journey taught me that family love isn't automatically healthy love. People can genuinely believe they're acting in your best interest while causing significant harm. Good intentions don't excuse harmful impact, and you're not obligated to absorb manipulation or abuse for the sake of family unity. If you're watching this and recognizing patterns in your own family, please know that your perceptions are valid and your well-being matters. Financial favoritism is a form of family abuse that has lasting psychological effects. You deserve relationships built on equality and respect, not systems that require you to sacrifice for other people's benefit. Document your experiences objectively. Seek therapy from professionals who understand family dysfunction. Set boundaries that protect your well-being, even if those boundaries disappoint family members who benefit from your sacrifice. Remember that you can love people while refusing to accept harmful treatment from them. Your worth isn't determined by how much hardship you can endure or how little support you need. Strength isn't measured by your ability to succeed despite neglect. You deserve care, support, and advocacy from the people who claim to love you. I'd love to hear from others who have navigated family favoritism or financial manipulation. How did you recognize the patterns? What strategies helped you establish boundaries? How did you heal from the psychological effects? Share your experiences in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more content about family dynamics, personal growth, and healing from difficult relationships. Remember that you're not alone in these experiences, and recovery is possible with the right support and boundaries.